what are you expecting from disclosure? What we find is that for many people, it means the official acknowledgement of our relationship to intelligence from beyond this world. In other words, they want to see an acknowledgement, not just on BBC and CNN, but they want to see it from the Kremlin. They want to see it from the White House. I don't know that that's going to happen in that way. Disclosure itself has been happening for a long time on many different levels. And just depends on what it is that you're expecting to see, what you believe in terms of what you're being shown, because obviously there's a narrative around the disclosure, not just the fact that disclosure is happening, but how the narrative is being driven. So these are things I want to talk to you about today. What is disclosure? What does it mean? What are the implications? What's the big deal? I've had young people come up to me at some of our events and say, what is the big deal? You know, we all know that we're not alone in the universe. So let me just kind of break this down a little bit. First of all, this will probably be part one of at least a two-part series, because there's so many facets of disclosure. And I think many of you know that for over 40 years of my adult life, I have been blessed to lead people into some of the most isolated and remote and pristine and magnificent and beautiful places remaining in the world today for the archaeological sites that we find there, but also because of the indigenous people that preserve the wisdom that we find in those archaeological sites. So I'll be clear, I have not been with every indigenous tradition, everywhere on the planet. Every indigenous tradition that I have ever been with allows for a relationship between them, their people, their communities, and a greater family in the cosmos, what they call their space family, their space brothers and sisters, or whatever. And it's more than just a reference to them. There's an interaction that happens, especially when I go into the Andes of southern Peru. I spend a lot of time leading groups into the Tibetan plateau, the 12 monasteries and 2 nunneries over 26 days, and the Tibetan people, among others. And the point is that they all allow for these relationships between us and a greater intelligence, an ongoing relationship that began a long time ago. It's only in the West where we, in the past, may have had a problem. And I say in the past because I believe that we are in the process of being conditioned, we have been since I was a kid, of accepting on a deeper level our relationship to intelligence from beyond this world. If you're old enough to remember, some of the first science fiction programs that came out in the late 50s and early 60s, on black and white television, and some of the first Star Treks that came out, and Lost in Space, with an AI intelligent robot that used to wave his arms around and say, "Danger, Will Robinson, danger, Will Robinson," and we laugh about those, but those were early efforts to begin conditioning the general population to think differently about ourselves and our relationship with the world. And so you say, well, why would we need to think differently? Well, I'm going to begin with that. It all comes down to, there were a couple of studies that were done. They were done back in the early 1960s, and then they were published later in the 60s, about what it would mean to us. How would it impact society and civilization to know that we're not all that there is, that the world doesn't revolve around us, that there's something else out there? And a couple of these think tanks, they did some really interesting research. One of them is the Rand Corporation. I know some of you are familiar with them. Another one is the Brookings Institute. The Rand Corporation, these are private organizations. And I'm looking over here. I don't have a formal PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to reference some notes for accuracy, and I want to give you some direct quotes. I wanted to put this out quickly so that we could build on this, because of some of the things that are happening in the news cycles that are coming around over the next few days, next couple of weeks. I wanted you to have a little bit of a context from my perspective, because you've asked for that. So these are private think tanks, private corporations that consult with the authorities, with U.S. military, with governments all over the world. And the Rand Corporation was interesting because when they were asked about their positions, they denied that they had done any work or any reference or any acknowledgement of intelligence from beyond our world. And finally, through enough asking, and I think it's through freedom of information could have played a role in this, they acknowledged an internal memo. It was dated November 27, 1968, where they developed a memo, and it was broken down into a number of different parts. Part 5 is actually called UFOs, How to Proceed and Why. So it shows us the RAND Corporation was looking into this, and they gave all kinds of scenarios about what could happen, and if these things happened, what it would mean. It was kind of like a fault tree. If this, then that. If this, then that. So I'm just sharing this because it goes to show they were being asked to explore this and to think about it. I think the really important one, probably the one that had the greatest impact, was from the Brookings Institute. This is from 1962, and I'm going to read directly from this. I want to get this right. And what they were doing, the Brookings Institute, was taking case histories from anthropological studies here on Earth. What did it mean to societies that had been cut off from the rest of the world? So these are tribes that were, and again, this is back in the 60s. And these were new tribes that were being found in primarily in South America and Africa, or in the Pacific, on islands that had been cut off from the rest of the world. And by being cut off, this is the important thing, that they were absolutely certain of their place in the world and of their place in the cosmos. They had they were very entrenched in an idea of who they were and where they were with relation to the rest of the cosmos. Now, we're not cut off from one another, but as a society, this applies to us. We have been conditioned to be very certain, very human-centric about who we are and our relationship to the world. Now, there have always been people, and maybe in your family and certainly in my family, we've always acknowledged that, the universe is a big place. And as Carl Sagan said, it would be a terrible waste of space if we're all that there is, and we know that they're not. As a scientist, I have studied the archaeological, the anthropological evidence, the fossil records. I'm going to begin talking about those in some of the other programs. So I've always been very open to the idea. And for me, it wasn't a problem. It's never been a problem for me. But let me share with you why it was a problem, according to people at the Brookings Institute, and how this thinking led to the hiding of information that was coming out in the 20th century. So here's a direct quote from the Brookings Institute. It says, anthropological files contain many examples of societies that were sure of their place in the universe. So this is what I was just mentioning, which have disintegrated when they have had to associate with previously unfamiliar societies espousing different ideas and different life ways. Others that survived such an experience, so some of them disintegrated. They ceased to exist as a society. Those that did continue their societies, those that survived such an experience usually did so by paying a very high price of changes in values and attitudes and behaviors. So this is the official thinking back in the 1960s when it comes to the public revelation of what was happening with crash sites, with recoveries, not just in the United States, but these were happening all over the world. Recently, we're finding as far back as 1933, a vehicle, an extraterrestrial vehicle, had crashed in Italy during the rule of Mussolini and was given to the U.S. because of our relationship with them at the time and the technical expertise. In the cultural traditions of all those places that I mentioned previously, from the Andes Mountains into the Tibetans, they've always had records, written records, oral traditions, and in some cases have actually harbored the occupants of the vehicles that have crashed or landed on Earth among the indigenous populations, and they have learned from them and communicated with them over a period of many years and developed their cosmology based upon those relationships. So I'm going to talk about that more in another video. What I want to talk to you about right now is the disclosure itself, the way it's happening, how it's being presented to us, and what it may mean, and what the concerns are about that. So there is a process. It's a concerted process that is becoming a little bit more apparent. Congressional testimony that the U.S. is two things: in possession, well, first, has a secret crash recovery program, number one. Number two, is in possession of non-human aircraft or non-human craft. And number three, in possession of non-human bodies, biological recovery. So this is kind of where things are right now. And you can see that it's not spontaneous. This is a directed rollout. Some people are calling this a soft disclosure, rather than boom, just coming out one day and saying, we interrupt this program, for a special, like they do in the movies, for a special report. And you see, the Kremlin in Moscow and the president in the White House and leaders all over the world simultaneously making this announcement. That hasn't happened. And I don't know, again, that it will, because that would be a hard disclosure. This is soft disclosure, where it's coming out I believe, for a couple of reasons, soft disclosure. One, I think it is testing the public to see how the public responds to this. And number two, there appear to be different camps that have different visions and different agendas regarding disclosure, if it should happen at all. There's some that still don't want it to happen. Younger people are now coming into those jobs and those careers that have kept a lot of this secret, and older ones who signed those non-disclosures, including some of the former astronauts who signed the non-disclosures saying, we can't talk about what we experienced on the lunar surface. We can't talk about what happened when we were at the space station. Pilots say, we can't talk about what happened on our reconnaissance missions. All of them believing that those non-disclosures were temporary. That surely, the astronauts, and I've had the opportunity to tour and to speak with and to know some of the former astronauts, and they all felt, it was the Cold War years. It was a different time. So disclosures were okay. Surely by the end of their lifetimes, something this big would be made known because of the implications. It wasn't. And so now they are dying. They're on their deathbeds and they don't want to take the secret to the grave. So some of them in their, last days or last hours of life are revealing, what it is that this happened. Can you imagine? Can you imagine having a direct experience that could change forever the lives of every man, woman, and child on the face of the earth? Having that as a military man or a woman, so you're under oath and you're on your mission, and being forbidden from sharing something like this when you see the world in the condition that the world is in right now, and how this information could help the world and change the world in truly beautiful ways. Emotionally, what would that mean? And there are all kinds of stories. I had the opportunity from a conference at one time. I was leaving a conference going back to the airport, and I was sharing a van with a lot of women, and I didn't know who those women were. And it was a long drive from the city where the conference was back to the airport. And so we started talking, and they were astronauts' wives. And apparently there was something called the Astronauts' Wives Club, where they come together and console and comfort and support one another in difficult missions. And they were sharing among themselves what they had seen their husbands go through emotionally and psychologically, because most of them were not trained. This is a part of the training the military doesn't do a lot of. Emotionally, what do you do with that kind of information? And sadly, there are stories, and we've all heard this. This isn't a secret. It's very public. Many of them turn to drugs and alcohol to to help desensitize them from the emotional pain and the mental pain and the psychological pain of not being able to share these extraordinary experiences, even with, they weren't supposed to share them with anyone, even with their spouses. So I had the opportunity to hear some of those stories. So the disclosure, we're in it. It's happening, and it has been happening. It's just happening on a little bit different level now. So I want to talk about a couple of different implications. Let me begin with the technological implication. We often hear about, although there are records of our interaction, the archaeological, anthropological, cultural records of our interaction with intelligence from beyond this world that go back thousands of years. It wasn't happening in the technological society that we have right now. So when we have those interactions in a technological society, it means something different. It means that we can up-level our technology. And that's exactly what began to happen. If you remember, back in the 90s, if you're old enough to remember back in the 50s and 60s, many of you know, I'm just giving an example, I'm a musician. And when I'm not doing what I'm doing now. And I remember my guitar amplifier in the late 1950s and early 1960s, when I'd put that amplifier on a stage and it was dark, behind that amp was lit up with this soft violet glow from the vacuum tubes that were called, and some of you musicians will know this, they're called 6L6 power vacuum tubes in the back of the amplifiers, in the head of, for example, a big Silvertone amplifier or something like that, because we were still living in the age where everything was running on vacuum tubes. Young people have never seen, young people today, I've been in audiences, they have no idea what a vacuum tube is. They've never seen them because we live in a world of miniaturized components and printed circuits. And those are the result of reverse engineering in the 1950s and 60s that was happening from technology that was coming to this world. It either crashed or been brought down or landed intentionally, but was kept secret, kept under wraps. And it's really interesting how quickly we made that leap from vacuum tubes and the mysteries of life. And all of a sudden, we had insights into DNA. All of a sudden, we had insights into miniaturized technology, microcircuits, transistors, resistors, capacitors, without the vulnerability of those vacuum tubes. And this is one of the implications. So one of the concerns, people say, well, what would it mean if we had that disclosure? There's the technological implication. The moment that we have this disclosure, that we have technology from other intelligence, other civilizations, either other planets or other star systems, more likely. And it's not based on the burning of something to release the energy. All of our energy is based on, we burn something that has captured sunlight. Either it's coal or it's wood or it's the fossil fuels or whatever it is. But we have to destroy something to capture the energy to drive whatever it is we're going to be driving. Turbines for electricity, or automobiles, or whatever it is. Presumably the technology that has brought an intelligent form of life from another star system, it's not going to be based on that. It's going to be based upon fundamental principles of physics, drawing energy from the very foundation of the field that underlies all existence, something called the Planck field, named after Max Planck, the physicist, the early 20th century. And this is no secret. Again, we know this, and physicists work with this. Tiny fluctuations on the quantum level that can be captured, and those fluctuations, those movements, can be harnessed and amplified into meaningful forms of energy. The moment we do that, we no longer, think about what that means. We no longer need a fossil fuel. We don't need nuclear power. We don't need natural gas. We don't need gasoline in the tanks of our cars. We don't need to burn wood. We no longer need power lines to carry energy across our society, across our communities, our nations, our planet, under the oceans. Communication changes, industries will change. And for some people, that change is frightening. And it's frightening because they're looking at it from a perspective of loss. And that is one perspective based in fear. There are other perspectives. Yes, it would change the industry. It would open the door to new industries, new technologies. So what that would mean, for example, everyone would have a device sitting in your home somewhere, in a closet somewhere. And that device would be powering everything in your home with no wires, not plugged into the wall. It doesn't need to be renewed because it's drawing on the Planck vacuum, the infinite supply of energy that we have available to us today. The same with an automobile. Automobiles would have a little gadget, they're about this big, the ones, the prototypes that I've seen, that would sit in, somewhere in the trunk of the car or under the hood or wherever it is. There would be no fuel. You would still need fossil fuels for the other 6,000 applications in our daily lives that are based upon fossil fuels. We simply would no longer be burning it. So if we're really concerned about climate change, if for those that really believe that CO2 is driving the climate change, even though the science, the peer-reviewed science doesn't support that, may be contributing, it's not the cause. And we can say that because the climate change would be here even if humans were not here. We can see that in the geologic record. And if you believe that humans are the cause of that CO2, which also isn't supported by the science, I talk about this in the other videos, but if you really believe those things, I would think you would want this energy. You would want the disclosure to reveal this kind of energy. But ultimately, in a world where we are seeing the effort to remake the world, the Great Reset, to consolidate power, to centralize power, of energy and electricity, to centralize finances, to centralize government, to centralize food production, a source of energy like this would do just the opposite. It would free us from the bonds and the shackles of the fear and the control of those who want to have power over the masses. And it would free humankind for the first time, I think, in 5,000 years of recorded human history, making energy available to every man, woman, and child that wants it. There are indigenous communities that don't want energy. I've visited with them, and I respect that. But those that want it, and it would unleash innovation and imagination and creativity to begin building a world that we all know is possible in our hearts. We would see that in our lives. We could have had these possibilities between 70 and 100 years ago, because that's how long we've had the technology. So when this disclosure happens, this is one of the implications, the technological implications. Another implication is social implication, and this is what the Brookings Institute was talking about. What does it mean to society when we think, man, we're it, and all of a sudden we find out we're maybe a little it in the presence of a much bigger it? What does that mean? Well, interestingly, the Catholic Church has had to come to terms with this, and I have a statement from them. Very interesting. The Jesuits, I think many of you know, are the scientific arm of the Catholic Church. The Jesuits had a conference and released a paper. What would the existence of intelligent extraterrestrials, would it be consistent with Catholic belief? I think the question is funny. Are you going to have an unintelligent extraterrestrial? I mean, if they're here from somewhere else, they're obviously very intelligent. Our civilization, you think about this, civilization, we're told, began about 5,000 years ago. That's this cycle of civilization. Technology science is only about 300 years old. Who or whatever it is that's coming to visit us presumably has been around much, much longer. Look at what we've accomplished in 300 years, and then take that to the level. What would it mean if you, for 1,000 years, which is nothing, or 5,000 or 10,000 years of a civilization in terms of AI, artificial intelligence, holographic projections, longevity, healing, I mean, all those things. So with the Catholic Church, their official stance, I'm going to read this to you directly. It says, the discovery of life on other worlds would not at all be inconsistent with Catholic belief, since it reflects the ability of the Creator to establish creatures wherever and whenever he wishes. So they're saying that if they're not saying it's out there, they're saying if we find it, it's not a problem for Catholic tradition, because the Creator, one Creator, can create life anywhere. There are some other religious institutions now that believe that beings are coming to our world to be saved from whatever tradition they have, because our religion and the religion that these people have been indoctrinated into leads them to believe that this is the only place that where that can happen. So it's really interesting. You see some of the social implications that are happening here. So socially, what would that mean? And I think it would mean that the superpowers that have called themselves superpowers in the past are maybe not as super as they would like themselves to believe. It's interesting because most of the disclosure is coming through military channels. And my concern regarding that is that the military has viewed the craft that they cannot account for. Some of the craft in the footage are ours. We have reverse engineered them. We're flying them. Our pilots know how to fly them. I personally have seen one of these I've seen more than one, but I've seen one up very close in northern New Mexico. And absolutely certain it was ours. Didn't make a sound, didn't move fast, just, very, really, really interesting. This was back in the late 90s. So the concern is that from a military perspective, what's happening in the news is we're being told there are things in our skies that we don't know what they are, but don't worry, because we'll protect you. So the military is taking a stance, at least publicly, that looking at this as a threat. Honestly, my perspective is if you've come from a civilization, either a star system away or even planets away, and you've got the power to be here, you've got the technology, if you were ever going to hurt the people of the earth, it could have happened anytime, over the last 200,000 years. That's how long we've been here. I don't think they're coming to hurt us. That's my perspective. Now, there's indications that our ancestors tell us there are multiple intelligences, and some of them are more benevolent than others. Some of them, it's not that they're mean, it is that they are very goal oriented. And if their goal is, to find a planet to live on, then it may be that if there's anything standing between them and that goal, they have the means to remedy that. So I think we're looking at more, and again, as a scientist, I'm sharing it with you from the scientific perspective. My personal feeling, my personal understanding from dealing with indigenous people is we are dealing with multiple intelligences from other worlds, because Earth is a really interesting place for a lot of reasons. And one of those is because of our biology. And that leads me to the third implication, the biological implication. We have bodies. Native Americans here in northern New Mexico have found living survivors, and they lived with them according to their reports. I did not meet them personally, but according to their reports, and they lived with them and they learned from them. And while they are biologically not human, as we would call human, they are DNA based. And through our DNA, we have to have a common ancestor. There's a common ancestry that seeded DNA in this cosmos. And so there is a relationship, maybe a distant cousin, but they have two arms, they have two legs, they have two eyes. They apparently from the autopsies, their internal organs function a bit differently, but they do have lungs, they do breathe oxygen. So even though they're not us exactly, we are similar enough that we have a common ancestor somewhere a long time ago. And there's a whole story that we can go into behind that. So what does that mean? if they have been around for hundreds of years? What does that mean to the implications for healing and the implications for longevity? And those have implications in industries that exist today, the medical industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and all of these things. So we're seeing, we're living in this time where we're seeing pushback from the old guard. We're seeing young people that want to embrace the new information. This is happening in politics. I remember I live in the state of New Mexico again. Our governor, Bill Richardson, was a governor from what years? From 2003 to 2011, Bill Richardson. And one of the things that he did when he became governor is the story goes, he didn't tell me this personally, but the story is that his wife asked him to look into this and see if there was any truth to what had happened in Roswell, New Mexico. It's our state here, back in the mid 1940s, and he ran up against a brick wall. He could not find, he wasn't given access to that information. Some of our former presidents wanted to come forward with it, and things happened in their administrations that sidetracked them from being able to do that. So the point is that we are living a time now where the technology that we have will be deeply influenced by disclosure. That was not the case 300 years ago, or maybe even 100 years ago per se. Not the way it is right now. And our society will be deeply influenced by disclosure in terms of the consolidation of power, the centralization of control levied by fear. Because I think what will happen is when the disclosure happens at the level that we suspect this is going, that we're going to think of ourselves differently. One of two things will happen. We either have to deny that we are part of a greater community, and then you don't have to deal with it. So there's an old saying, denial is a big river in Egypt. And there's some people that will do that. Some people will be so locked into their either religious or spiritual doctrine that they will resist the implications. A lot of people, I think, will be open to the implications, and the power structures that are alive and well and bustling in our world today that are all jockeying for power. You can see this happening. They're jockeying for the best position as the world goes into the great shift, the great reset. Geologically, there are things happening now and in our near future. Climatologically, things are happening now and in our near future that are very different from what we've lived in the past. And there's a jockeying for positions of power and control, and disclosure is going to be a part of that. And I think it's up to us. It's up to us in terms of how we accept it in our lives. So I am going to invite you to do your own due diligence. Look into this, but look into it from beyond the mainstream media, because that is the narrative that's being directed. Okay, there's a narrative out there. 7 corporations own all the major media in the West, including Sky News, BBC, PBS, NPR, Fox, MSNBC, CNN, MSN. I mean, all of it, as different as they look to us on the outside, there is a common thread. And when a narrative is driven, you will hear the words and the language identical throughout all of these. And this is happening with disclosure. So I'm going to invite you to go beyond. I mean, it's interesting to watch it, certainly. And there's some good independent sources that you can see in social media, kinds of media. I'm going to invite you to go into your heart, because there is a neural network of about 40,000 sensory neurites in every human heart, discovered in 1991. And although we've been conditioned away from using this reliably in the modern world, this was a foundation for our ancestors. It's a foundation for indigenous traditions all over the world. It's a foundation for deep intuition. It is a foundation for the coherence between the heart and the brain that gives us access to our own biology so that we can self-regulate our immune system and our longevity enzymes and super memory and super learning and super cognition and resilience to change. And all of that begins in the heart. And, I've talked about in all the other videos. I don't want to be redundant here. I'm going to invite you to go into your heart when you hear what it is that's happening. And I think this is going to be really important, because if we are given a reason to fear our relationship to intelligence beyond our world, if we're given that reason, the question is, it's our choice in terms of how we respond to that fear. And ultimately, I think this is what disclosure is going to do with each of us. It's going to drive us to come to terms with who we are in this world, who we are in the cosmos, who we are spiritually, and what a deeper relationship with intelligence from beyond our lives can mean to us. And we're all going to have different answers to that. But the way we answer that individually is going to determine collectively how we move forward with what is now being called disclosure. And moving through the nation, there's a lot of tough times, a lot of difficult things happening, but in the midst of all that, there is optimism that something is afoot, something is happening that is ultimately going to make life better for all of us. It's hard to isolate one thing because there's so many things happening simultaneously. There are certainly local politics here in our nation. There are geopolitics that are happening. There is the disclosure process that is kind of a backdrop for all of this. And it's all happening at the same time. And I think to some degree, it's all interrelated. And
orchestrated or something.
Well, I was just going to say that the way the information comes out. So, the disclosure, for example, I'm fascinated by the process. I'm optimistic. I'm also a realist. And realistically, when I sit down and think about it, John, it's still talk. All that has happened are words. We still have not seen anything physical come up in a congressional hearing or anything other than, alluding people talking to other people that have direct access to this. And I don't doubt that it's there, but I think it's interesting. If we're going to have this disclosure, why not just bring this stuff forward and say, here's an example.
I've told you before that I got this group together years ago to talk about how the potential implications of disclosure, and we used some fairly sophisticated software to try to map the second and third order potential implications of this, and we came up with something like 38 different scenarios, and only 3 of them didn't blow up in some kind of way or another. And I can assure you that people in the government have some sense and idea about that in general, and that they are, for whatever reason, and however they've decided to do this, I mean, they are kind of opening their kimono in a way. Now, it'd be naive to suggest that it's all open and above board, and there is no underlying objectives or things. I sat across the table from Lou Elizondo once at lunch and said, somebody inside the system said it was okay for you to come and talk about this, and he'd say, "What makes you say that?" And I said, "Because you're sitting across the table from me, and I know enough about how this thing works to know that you would be dead if you were out running around, freelancing around a subject like this that was as highly classified as this was." And so there is some kind of decisions been made. I mean, I always come back, as I've said to you in the past about this and to others, is to say, if they were going to do this, why wouldn't they kind of naturally? I mean, they've conditioned the space for this sequentially more and more and more over many kind of years with movies and other kinds of stuff. And so why that it's antithetical to the whole kind of operation of government, the psychology of government, to do jolts to the system. I mean, what they always are trying to do is to smooth things over and get so it's predictable in a sense. And so I just don't know how else they do it and I understand all the arguments and a lot of people raise about the methodology, and then they presume that it's all being orchestrated and so on. And it'd be stupid not to think that there was some sense of orchestration. But on the other hand, I know some of these guys, and
Yeah.
I've been convinced that they're just trying to do what they think is the right thing to do.
I know some as well, and I agree with you, John. I think they personally are coming from a good place. They may not be aware, or maybe they are aware
Sure.
that they are. I'm not going to use the word pawn because that has negative implications, but they are certainly players on a chessboard that are being influenced by, by higher influences, so that they can come forward and do what they're doing now. I guess last 2 weeks since we had one of our quartet sessions, I made it a point to go through and just sat down, took a couple of hours and watched as many of the pieces, not just the testimony, but what's interesting is you've got one piece of testimony, then you've got all of the media sources that are now reporting on that testimony. And the thing that has really seemed to become a focus is a frightening and negative possibility that these forms of life from other worlds are a threat to us.
Yeah.
And so they're really capitalizing on a few statements that said people have died, Americans have died, military has died, and whether or not it was intentional or not, they don't know. I mean, if you've got a form of energy and propulsion that's based on something that's so different than what we understand, and you make contact with that field, I can see where that wouldn't be good for a human body. I don't know that that's intentional, but it's being positioned that way. And
Yeah. Well, I understand, but the people that own the secrets are the military and the intelligence community, and the military and the intelligence community do not come out and say humanity is evolving and this is part of the evolution of humanity, and we need to embrace these people and look for ways in which no. They're from the intelligence community and from the government, from the Department of Defense. They're hardwired to look at this thing in terms of defense and threats and so on. I mean, that they put the name threat in terms of the institutional names that are all about this thing. I mean, I spent a lot of time running around in that organization, and there was just nobody that wasn't trying to defend the United States against threats. I mean, that's what they all believe. And so I just always come around saying, well, how else would you do this? There needs to be a counter. See, there is no function in government for building the good news and the bigger picture. I have advocated, I've built plans, and proposals, and I've sent them to the White House for having a White House office of the future that would look at these kinds of different scenarios and across the government about where it was all going and what the implications might be, and to be able to craft and integrate it a supra kind of perspective that would not just be the product of one of the institutions, one of the departments, one of the of government, each of which have, the Department of Housing and Urban Development sees the world through the lens of housing and urban development, and so it's from my experience, you just look at it and say, yeah, that's what they would do. Now, the question is, as you suggested, is how do you find an effective alternative narrative? How do you position this in a different kind of way that starts to raise the larger kind of question? But I don't know how you get it out of the government without it coming out the way it's doing.
Well, I think, at least in my experience, my circles, as I travel the world, not just here in my rural community, more often than not, the everyday person doesn't have much of a problem with disclosure and has pretty much accepted it, either in their family or in their culture or in their religion, that we are part of a greater community. it's the power structures that are having it. It's not the people. It's the
It's
power
always the
structures.
power structures. The
So
government's always to get us into wars. The people don't do that.
It is. So it's religion has a problem with that, and certainly certain industries have a problem because they're very short-sighted. What they see as a threat to the current way of doing things, they're not looking at all the potential of all the new applications from new technology that will be open, and where that leads us. So it's just interesting to see how that whole thing is coming down. I think I mentioned this to you once before. Actually, the first time you and I met, I had just done a program at the DC Convention Center, and I was talking about a book called The God Code that came out in 2004, and the intelligent information encoded into the human genome. And my question was, if we ever had DNA from another form of life, would it have those same patterns? And then we took a break, and there were a couple of guys that had come into the room in dark suits, and one of them came up to me and he said, let me know when you'd like to see that. And he gave me some phone numbers. But the question I asked him, John, I think this goes to your point. I said, do you have a problem with what I'm saying here? And it was really interesting. He said, we don't have a problem. We don't know, and I don't know who we is. He just said, we don't know exactly how to share this information. So I'd asked him the question. I said, why are you in this room? Why'd you come see me speak? And he said, we wanted to see how you were coming at this because we don't really know the best way. There's so many different ways. We don't know the best way to do this. And then I said, do you have a problem with what I'm doing? And he said, no. He said, because you're doing it responsibly, you're not asking for a revolution or, anything. And you're professionally and responsibly and objectively saying this. So it told me then that, number one, we've already got the DNA. And number two, they want to, at least there is a segment that wants this to be known. And they are looking for the best way, to go about doing that. So,
but the problem is the system. The system has lied to humans about just about everything. And so it has no kind of intrinsic credibility, or at least for thinking people, as far as I'm concerned. And that means that even if you think about this, if Joe Biden stood up and said, the aliens are here and this is really great and it's going to help us all and everything, there's a whole bunch of people are going to sit back and they're going to say, what the world is this guy trying to do? What's his motivation? Because the government doesn't talk like that. And this guy, and it's all politics. And wow, we're coming up to an election. And it's just really hard. The system does not lend itself to that. And so you need, in a sense, the Stephen Greers of the world who are raising an alternative perspective, an intelligent alternative perspective. I don't agree with everything Stephen says, but if you didn't have that, then all you would have is the government, and you really wouldn't want that. And so somehow needs to be a different story, and the story needs to be a coherent story. And I don't know.
Well, it's interesting that all of this, I'm a big picture kind of guy, systems thinker, and I'm looking, all of this is happening within the context, the backdrop of a world that is marching toward increasingly escalated levels of conflict. And what this says to me, and having worked in the defense industry during the Cold War years, at that time it was Martin Marietta, now it's Lockheed Martin, is that the technology that's been reverse engineered by the military, obviously it's used for military applications. That means we've got weapons that we've never heard of available to us. And now we're looking at the potential of escalation and all the talk about a nuclear exchange. And I'm wondering if these weapons don't render nukes obsolete. If the kinds of weapons they're talking about now, energy-based weapons that take out life, but they don't take out the city. They don't take out the agriculture
sure.
like a nuclear weapon would do.
Right.
I'm wondering if we're going to see something like that pop up. We're looking at the movement to digitize the world, including the people of the world, to have us all in some kind of digital database. Between the time we did our last quartet and today, the developer of ChatGPT released a new digital currency called the World Coin. I think you're probably familiar with it. And the way to entice people to get acquainted with this is he has a device called the Orb, O-R-B, that he is circulating around the world, and people are lining up. They're lining up for blocks. They'll get there at 2:00 in the morning and camp out. And what the Orb does is it will take your biometric information. So you look into the Orb, to the lens, it's a retinal scan and whatever other biometrics. And in exchange for you doing that, they are giving free World Coin that people believe will increase in value. You and I and most of our viewers probably say, well, that's crazy. The young people are flocking in the big cities like New York and LA and places like that. They're flocking. They want to participate. They want to be in this database. They want the World Coin. And it is one more facet of this whole big picture that we're moving towards centralization within the context of disclosure, within the context of all this conflict. We're moving toward this centralization, and the stated goal from the Great Reset is to have a global database of every human on the face of the earth. And this appears to be an effective method for at least one demographic. A lot of people will never participate in this way, but they are capturing a large demographic of young people who think this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. And I thought it was a joke at first, and then I realized it wasn't, because the developer's a pretty serious guy. And ChatGPT is very effective, and I think any other thing he does is going to be effective. And then I was just kind of blown away, John, by how easily young people would be lured into divulging something as intimate as their own biometric data into a database. They have no idea where this information is going to go, how it's going to be used. And they're not even aware of the context within which this is happening, the Great Reset context. And this is, like I said, it's all in the mix right now. So I don't know where it goes. It's just, we're in it. And the only way out of it is to go through it. And we're going through it right now.
Well, where it goes is any of a number of places. And as I mentioned to you earlier, I've been talking to Neil Howe, who is the part of the Neil Howe and Bill Strauss couple that wrote the extraordinary book called Fourth Turning, which talks about the cyclical nature of American social generational kind of evolution, and how that there are four different kind of characteristic groups, column A, B, C, and D, and then they repeat themselves. And at the end of the fourth one, each one of them is a generation, 20, 22 years. And at the end of the fourth one, there's a fourth turning, and there's always a big, amazing kind of thing that happens, civil wars, World War II, and so on at the end of these things. And so his new book is something like Living Through. It just came out a week or so ago, and it's called Living Through the Fourth Turning. And I've thumbed through the back and found the scenarios in the back. And one of his scenarios is that there's a civil war in the United States. Another one says there's an external major war, not an internal one. And the third one is kind of a combination of the two. And he lines up all of the different characteristics that point toward from history about civil wars and how they happen, how they manifest themselves, what are the underlying dynamics, how they progress. And, his I haven't gotten to the end of the book, so I can't tell you what the end of the thing is yet, but it's certainly, in the similar terms that kind of Martin Armstrong does, talks about that there is, before the light at the end of this tunnel, there is a lot of disruption that's going to happen in the next few years. And it is going to be very interesting in the terms that you're talking about, and in the terms of the objectives that we're interested in. That is to say, this new evolutionary jump and the move to a new human. How do you do that with the generational types and groups of people who have this point of view that you've just described? How do you make this through this kind of whole cohort of people? How does that turn out downstream and such on? Because it seems to be so counterproductive, dysfunctional even to you and me.
Yeah.
And so I sympathize with your point of view.
Well, this is, when I say I'm optimistic, I'm not looking at the world through rose-colored glasses. I'm a realist, and we're going to go through tough times before we get to whatever's on the other side. My optimism, John, is I believe that we have an opportunity, a rare and precious opportunity for this rare and precious moment in time where we can not manipulate or control, but we can participate in this evolutionary process. And yes, we, I believe, have the ability to determine whether we come in a soft landing or a really hard landing, or something in between. And I think one of the keys, John, and I'm a student of this, and I'm still learning, it is about learning to listen to the younger generation, because as you just stated perfectly, is they think differently, they have different expectations, because they have been fed information, funneled information for at least 2 generations now, that leads them to a different conclusion about who they are, what their relationship in life to the world is, and what it means, what their lives mean, what are the possibilities in their lives. And they're not being told the things that you and I were told when we were kids, that we were in a land of opportunity. It wasn't guaranteed outcomes, no guarantees, but the guaranteed opportunity to work hard to achieve and accomplish a goal. Our young people are not being told that. And they're being told that they're victims of a corrupt and broken system based upon hate, racism, all of these things. And so when I listen to the way they think of themselves and their relationship to the world, it helps me to understand what words to say and how to reach them with a message of hope and possibility. Again, no guarantees, but the opportunity to participate rather than feeling like this is all happening to us, that we are part of the solutions. And I think that's there's a nuance there, and it's a very powerful nuance. And there are some young people that here's a real life example. I'm a rural area in northern New Mexico. I got a pickup truck, went to get some new tires on my pickup truck. I went to the tire shop, and the guy said, well, the good news is we've got them in stock. He said, the bad news is, he said, we close at 6 p.m. He says, but I'll work until 8 or 9 tonight to get this done. And I said, well, why is it going to take so long? He was 29 years old. He said, we can't get anybody to work. And I said, why not? He said, young people my age feel like it's not worth their time. I said, what are they doing? How do they survive? He said, they're staying home with their parents. They do get some government money. It's not a lot, but they would rather compromise and sacrifice the things in their lives to squeak by on the little that they have, rather than work to achieve the goals. And he said, I was raised on a farm, and my parents never raised me and my brothers that way. And we think differently. We work hard, and we've got things in life. We've got a family. He had a family. He had a son. And he said, but this is the reason it's going to take so long to get these tires on your truck. He said, we have the job openings and they're paying well, but people don't think of work the way that they used to think about work. And I think that is one of the symptoms when we want to
Well,
share the possibility of a new human story, you're speaking to people that have been conditioned to believe the things that this man told me his friends believe.
there's so many moving parts, and it's all just accelerating so quickly that it's really hard to keep your head around it. If you're spending any time trying to honestly think about it, there are a lot of people that aren't, and they're just that are being carried downstream by it all. But so, what you been thinking about? What's up?
John, right now, for some people out of left field, we had a disclosure about our relationship, the human relationship and the American relationship, to not just the possibility of life beyond this world, but physical evidence of technology, as well as the life forms that accompany that technology. And in some circles, it is upending everything that we have known to be true in the past. And there are other circles who are discounting all of it. Mainstream media is either not covering it or they are covering it, and they're covering it from a very skeptical or a very distorted perspective. So, John, it's easy to get caught up in that conversation, and you and I have had plenty of them. The question I ask is when this is validated, as we know it will be, because we know about the physical evidence, what happens next?
We have craft, and for decades, and we've had craft and exotic materials that have not been made from somewhere else, and we literally have bodies and so on from, and we know that they're not from here, and that is the first time that the United States government is definitively, to the extent he's not in the government anymore, but clearly he's not doing this if somebody hasn't kind of told him that it's okay to talk about it at some level. You've made the point before that the government is very complex, and there are lots of parts, and some don't know what the other ones are doing, and then this is kind of one of those kind of situations where probably some aspect thinks it's a good idea to talk about this, and others really don't, and so they tried to put him in jail, but he beat the rap, if you will, and so he's out and talking about this, and so it raises this larger and more fundamentally significant kind of issue about what in the world and what's the implications of this. Let me tell you a little story. Is that years ago, when I had the Arlington Institute going in Arlington, Virginia, I was told by somebody who seemed to have a reason to have an opinion and had the access and so on, that there was a possibility is that there was going to be a disclosure event back in 92 or something like that. I don't remember when it was, but it was back in that period, or maybe it was 96. I don't remember. And I never figured out whether they were just feeding me this stuff to try to find out what I'd do with it and who I'd tell and whatever. But what I did was I brought together very quietly a small group of very high level people from different areas, from the military, from the press, from the science, from the intelligence community, and others that were personal friends of mine from politics. And I literally, in some cases, said, show up next Tuesday at 1:00, and I'm not telling you what's happening, but you just show up. It's going to be worth your while. And I had the kind of relationships that these folks would do that, and so they showed up. And what we did was an afternoon scenario planning process to try to identify what the potential implications of this might be. We did implications analysis, and we did it using some technology that Joel Barker called it implications wheel. Joel designed. And I swore them all to secrecy. They can't tell anybody who else was in the room and all that kind of stuff. And we spent all afternoon kind of systematically going through and analyzing all of the potential implications. And the way his technology works is that it allows you to kind of take a core kind of issue and then kind of like a daisy run out in different kind of directions, like what is this going to mean for economics or politics or religion or science and so on. And then you can build the third order kind of implications and the fourth order implications, and you can build this out kind of systematically into a whole kind of assessment of what the whole thing would be. And the bottom line was very kind of galvanizing, kind of really got our attention, because when we got finished with this thing, when we got to the end, there were, if you consider a certain path through this network as a scenario, there were something like 38 scenarios that we had that, again, that related to science and technology and religion and other such things, politics. And there were only 2 or 3 of all of those things that didn't blow up the local world symbolically in one way or another. The whole disclosure process was fraught with potholes at best and cliffs at worst, where you would if you and the 3 scenarios that worked, you just had to line everything up, had to 1, 2, 3, 4, all had to just line up perfectly in order for the thing to come out and be relatively benign on the back end of the whole thing. And there were a number of people in that room who were very knowledgeable about this whole subject, came from other places. And they all just sat there. They told me this for years since, and they said that was one of the most profound things I ever went into, because there are all kinds of people running around saying, just disclose this and make it come out. And they've never thought about the potential downstream implications of all of this. And so the whole disclosure process necessarily with that kind of information and that kind of knowledge, which I know worked its way kind of circuitously back into the government in one way or another, they're very careful in trying to, in the way that they try to navigate through all of this, because they know that it could just really go sideways pretty quickly. At the same time, there clearly is some kind of a push from inside, externally, internally. I don't know how what it is and how it works, but there's an imperative, a growing imperative, whether it's the aliens that are wanting to talk, I don't know, that are saying, we got to get this out. So it's a real kind of interesting minefield going forward into this space about how do you kind of tiptoe through all of this in such a way that you cause the least amount of collateral damage in the whole process. And the way that a lot of people are responding to this guy Grush, who came out and saying, "Oh, it's all an op, and they're all trying to set us up for something else like that." I mean, we anticipated all of that way back then, decades ago. That was a likely way in which people would act. And of course, they're going to then say, "Well, you've been lying to us. You're obviously been lying to us for decades. What else are you lying to us about?" And so the whole situation is very, very complex, and it's very fluid, and it can go any of a number of ways. But it's kind of like, it drives me into the position of saying, well, how do you do it if you don't just at some level kind of just go do it and then just try to manage it in the best way you can? But it clearly has extraordinary implications, and really the most profound one, as far as I'm concerned, is who we are as humans. And what is our position relative to not only this planet, but the local area in the galaxy or the solar system, for that matter? Because everything in life essentially has been terrestrially centric, and what this is doing is saying all of the kind of little models and all of the concepts that we've all had and that we grew up with, and the assumptions that we've made about everything, and how we've organized ourselves, and how we think of who we are and consider our options and our decisions that we make are all up for grabs. And it's kind of like, you can jump off a cliff and you're up in the air, and the parachute hasn't opened, presumably. And it just has huge kind of implications.
John, I wish I had been in that meeting that you had back then. I would have loved to been there and been part of that.
That was pre-Gregg. Yeah.
When I think about this, of course, I don't think it's any surprise to anyone in our community that we're not alone. And I don't think it's a surprise to most cultures. Many of the indigenous cultures that I've spent time with in the last, I don't know, I've been traveling over 50 years now. They make room in their culture and their society for their family and their community that is not on this earth with us or with them. And they always have. Some of the archaeological evidence going back over 40,000 years in the Aboriginal traditions, for example, talk about our relationship with our family beyond this world. I think the only threat really comes to the power structures, and those power structures are what are regulating the narrative that we have right now. So the political structure, certainly, the financial institutions that are threatened, the religious institutions, among social, the way that we think of ourselves as a community, as a society. One of the interesting things, and you and I have talked about this, the first time you and I met, you picked me up in Washington, D.C. I had just spoken at the D.C. Convention Center about a book that I had written in 2004. It was called The God Code, and it was the result of my background as a senior computer systems designer during the Cold War, specializing in pattern recognition software and applying those principles to the human genome, and actually finding an intelligent, meaningful bit of information in the human genome. There's intelligent information encoded into the DNA. So I had just shared that in the DC Convention Center, and we were taking a break. And there's a man that had come in, two men, but only one of them approached me during the conference. And they were the typical all black suits. They had dark sunglasses on indoors, which was a little unnerving to me. A little curly Q earpiece. And the guy came up to the stage. And just before the break, John, I'd made a statement that I'd never made at any of my conferences before, because I was talking about human DNA. I said, this is the message that we now know exists within human DNA. And then I said, I would love to have some DNA from life that's not from this planet to see if their genome has the same message. Let's take a break. And so the guy, when he approached me, he came up and he said, I asked him the question, I said, you guys have a problem with me talking about this stuff? And he said he didn't. And then he gave me a piece of paper and he said, when you're ready for that DNA from beyond this planet, call one of these numbers. And there were three phone numbers. There was a White House number, a Pentagon number, and a private number. I wasn't ready to make that phone call at that time. I didn't, for a number of reasons, I didn't make that phone call. But it told me that we have that DNA, or at least we have a printout. I wasn't asking for the physical sticky gooey stuff in my hands, just if we had a printout of the genome from life beyond this world. So I asked him, I said, do you have a problem with us talking about this? And what he said to me was really interesting. He said, we want to share this information. So whoever he represented wanted to share it. He says, we don't know the best way to do it without scaring people. And as you know, we don't have a problem with what you're doing because you're not threatening, you're not asking for a revolution, you're not angry about the misinformation and the disinformation over 70 years. So he said, no, you're doing it very responsibly. We don't have a problem with that. So it told me that we had the physical evidence. When we talk about that physical evidence, and it comes from a number of places. We hear a lot about crash sites. What you rarely hear about is there have been at least 2 archaeological recoveries of craft that are not from this world that were very intact. and that were presumably functional. By the time they crash, I don't know how much functionality remains. So, and those are two that I know about. There may be others, certainly. I believe there are 33 recovered craft, and I don't know that they are all the product of crashes. We have the technology to take them down through non-conventional scalar weaponry. Our scalar beams, our scalar weapons can disable those kinds of craft. And I don't know if they can bring them down, gently or not. But when I think about all of this, it's going to happen. There's a disclosure that's happening now, and it's not happening within a vacuum. And as a systems thinker, when I step back and I think of some of the really good and beautiful things that could happen if disclosure is done well, if it's done honestly. And one of those, John, as a geologist, I'm watching closely the dynamics, the geophysical dynamics of our planet that are triggering the climate change. It is the heating of the oceans from under.
That's right.
Under the seafloor. It's not coming from the atmosphere. Well, they found more than they had recognized. But here's what's happening: the mantle is being disturbed through the dynamics of the core. It's a whole conversation that we haven't had in this particular format. But the mantle is being disturbed. There are mantle plumes of magma that are now rising into the thin portions of the Earth's crust. The crust averages about 36 miles thick, which isn't very thick, but there are places where it's much thinner. Greenland is one of those where the ice is melting from underneath. Antarctica and the Marianas Trench, certainly the bottom of that trench. And also a lot of volcanic activity is happening. For example, the caldera in Yellowstone. Yellowstone, parts of it are closed because of the recent uptick in the magma activity underneath. So I look at these things and, the technology that would allow a life form to travel either within our solar system between planets or between other galaxies. That technology could also allow us to avert some of the tragedies that may lie ahead of us, for example, by degassing those magma plumes before they erupt, like they have in the historical past, creating a volcanic winter for 2 or 3 years that prevents the sunlight from coming through and has affected life. We saw this during the Younger Dryas. Between 12 and 13,000 years before present. And we've seen it, then we saw it 24,000 years ago as well. So I think when I think about this and the timing, and there are so many efforts to restructure the systems of the earth and to reset social systems and financial systems. And now, if they are being built around the implications of this threat, that we see that's triggering the change in the climate the way it has in the past and all the things that go with that, this disclosure may open the door to the technologies that would help avert some of the greatest humanitarian crises that we've ever seen. And by making that technology available, making it public to the greater scientific community to apply to these problems. And I think that's been one of the issues I mentioned in our quartet program. One of the reasons that this information has been kept secret is because of 2 studies that were done way back in the 1960s. One was by the Rand Corporation, and the other one, I don't know who I mentioned it.
Brookings.
The Brookings Institute. And their conclusions were based on what we knew back in the 60s about the disruptive nature. They were looking at anthropological studies of other cultures who believed that they had a solid understanding of their place in the world. And when those understandings were disrupted, those cultures disintegrated. And so the conclusions were drawn that the same thing would happen on a global basis. That was a different time. And I think we're beyond that, John. And I don't necessarily think that's what would happen now.
Yeah,
but that's where.
But the principles are the same. And if you have a giant kind of seismic disruption of this magnitude, you would have to reconstitute an intellectual framework, an existential framework, if you will, for the emergent new world that comes out of the back end of the thing. Because you would have new ideas about who you were and how the reality works, and this dramatically different awareness, coupled with the resident memories of the extraordinary disruption that everybody had just come through, which would open up the possibilities of thinking about other kinds of things. And if you then parachute in things like we're talking about, alien life and who knows what else, AI, any number of other such things, rapid climate change. I mean, it's for 16 years now, it's been getting colder. And so, if they suddenly settled in that everybody figured out it's going to get really cold for a while. I mean, all of those kinds of things in combination with a bunch of other kind of things, you have to rethink who you are, what you're doing, where you're going. And it's a marvelous. I always end up kind of thinking about it almost like the framers of the Constitution for the United States way back when they were trying to structure a whole new world and a new social relationship and economic and governmental and other kind of things. I mean, that's what we're going to have to do.
Well, John, I agree. And we'd have to rethink everything. I think it's all about the way it's done. If we had global leaders that came together out of their genuine love and care for their perspective or respective nations, and they came together and they said to the people of the earth, we have this opportunity to come together and do great and beautiful things through our humanness and to open ourselves to this deeper relationship with forms of life that have been here longer than we have, that understand more than we do. If something like that were done, it could be a great and beautiful, beautiful thing. My concern right now, it's being positioned when you watch the mainstream narrative, is that there are things in the sky that we don't understand. And so therefore it's a threat. And as you've said before, the military is trained to see the potentiality of threats so that they can ward those threats off. It's like if all you have is a hammer, everything's going to look like a nail. So my concern is the way that this is coming about. And I think conversations like this, like you and I are having, I think are important in our community. But John, when I'm not traveling, I do a lot of domestic things. People are surprised. They see me in the grocery stores and they say, you do your own shopping? And I said, well, I mean, like, who else is going to do it,
Yeah.
And so I was at a CVS and I was looking around at the customers that were in line in front of me in CVS. And I asked myself, what difference would disclosure make to the people in line in front of me? And I think to a large extent, these are people that are concerned with daily survival. They're not necessarily thinking big picture kinds of things. And I think it would mean something very, very different to them than it would to think tanks.
In the short term. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, in the short term. So I think when I look at, I mean, I've made the list of all the power structures, the religious structures, political structures, cultural, spiritual, social, certainly the financial markets would all be deeply impacted because they're all based on psychology. Mm-hmm. And our psychology would undergo this rapid and tremendous shift to accommodate something. And it's interesting because I think intellectually, most people are open to the idea of life and a community greater than our Earth intellectually. Yeah. As a removed conversation, because we've been watching Star Trek, since the 1960s.
We've been acclimated, right?
But when it really, and I'll just share with you, I'm a geologist. I have been contracted as a consultant on an archaeological project that is is working with artifacts depicting our relationship with life from beyond the world, this world. Thousands of artifacts showing our relationship in terms of, there are maps of the solar system, for example, that are so accurate. They're showing rings around Neptune and around Jupiter, rings that we didn't know existed until the 20th and early 21st century. These artifacts are between 8 and 10,000 years BP, before present. And when you can actually hold a physical object depicting these relationships, and you see spaceships depicted in our relationship, and you see birthing scenes that appear to be representing hybrid forms of life from the cosmos and us. When you hold those, that shifts the perspective from intellect, and all of a sudden you've got this tangible representation of what this is. And I think something similar to that may happen to the everyday person.
I think you're exactly right.
Yeah.
I think what changes in the lives of your neighbors who are in line at the CVS is when they see some kind of a video or some kind of a coherent picture, as you've suggested, that says that builds the logic about how their life and how our lives are going to change because of all of this. Because otherwise, if you don't have the framework, then the stuff is kind of random, and you don't see where the puzzle pieces fit together.
Well, so this was what came to me in my moments of imagination and creativity, waiting in the CVS line. I said, okay, so it's a month after disclosure. Does that mean, and it's not just one species apparently that's out there. There are multiple species.
Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of, in Star Wars when they walk into the bar and there are, everything from antenna-eyed, three-headed, So am I going to be standing in line at CVS with a bunch of species that looks like the Star Wars bar in front of me? Well, do you think that it would open the door to everyday interaction where they would now that it's okay, they would flood to the planet and live among us?
Well, you can't assume that they all look like the Star Wars bar scene, because apparently, or so reportedly, there's a bunch of them that just look like us, and in some case, and there are all kinds of reports that say that they're all, there's a goodly number of them that live here and are part of the kind of evolutionary transitional process. I don't think I've ever. I've never knowingly run into anybody except our friend Penny Kelly, perhaps, who suggests that that's where they came from or what. And I don't know. I don't know. It's just interestingly fluid.
Well, I think the technological aspect, the science and the technology is where the greatest impact probably is going to happen, that will ripple from the science and technology. It will be outpictured through the economic and the financial systems because of the way we derive our energy, the way we grow our food, the way we heal our bodies. So I think it will trickle down into all those things.
Well, yeah, I agree with you, but I also think that, the way we all make sense and stay sane in this reality is that we have these models, these systems, these ideas that we have embraced, our paradigm, if you will, that all, whether it's real or not, it gives us some kind of positive feedback enough that we think that it describes predictably how this reality works. And one of the clear kind of potential implications of this disclosure business is that it starts to pull the pins out from underneath all of the underlying and the most fundamental assumptions about who we are and how this all works. And, if these guys show up and say, well, your idea about, history is all wrong, and so we'll give you a new idea, and your idea about religion is all wrong, and there's another way this all works. I mean, if you don't do that kind of nicely and gently, it could be very disruptive because you lose your kind of the tethers to stability that give you security and comfort and predictability.
Well, that's one of the exciting things. I mean, to be able to ask a form of life that's not from here, that may have traveled either from somewhere within our solar system, which is a big deal, but very probably from beyond our solar system, which is an even bigger deal. Ask them how this all happened. How did life begin? Where do we come from? And maybe they say, we don't know because we're still looking for that. Or maybe they can give us a little bit clearer definition of what all that means, a clearer picture. That means everything we teach in our schools is going to change. It means everything we teach in the university is going to change. The kind of physics that we use. I mean, can you think? I cannot think of a more exciting window of opportunity. It's a perfect time to be here. It's a perfect time to be alive. And I think we're going to see some speed bumps. But I also think we have the ability to smooth out those rough edges and do this in a good way. And I think the powers that be that have been since the early 1930s and the 40s, who have been and perpetuate the ideas of secrecy, I think they're in the minority. And the people that I know, military people who have taken the oaths to serve and to protect, government officials, it was during Clinton administration, I think John Podesta during the Clinton administration was laying the framework for disclosure before the other things happened that stole the limelight and defined that presidency. But I think it may have happened then. So I think that we have the consciousness to do this in a good way.
The biggest implications certainly has to do with the technology that would be revealed through the propulsion sources and how we could apply that in our lives. And when you think about that, maybe it gives us some insight into the resistance for disclosure. There are people that would prefer that we not have that kind of technology in our lives.
Or decisions been made somewhere at some level in the system that is allowing this all and saying the time is right. Let's do this, which again raises the question that we talked about in Quartet, which is why now? I mean, why? What's behind all of this? And with all due respect, I don't think it's just Stephen Greer pushing, or David Wilcock or whoever, all the other people in the space, which they are, and it's an element, but they're not just responding to those guys. There was something else bigger.
Yeah, I agree, John. I shared with you that actually the first time I came to Berkeley Springs was immediately after I'd done a presentation there at the DC Convention Center, and we had some people call them men in black. I don't know if that's what I would call them, but they were very interested parties that slipped into the conference that were all dressed in black, including black sunglasses in the middle of the conference, that came up to me during the break. And I flat out asked them, I said, do you guys have a problem with what I'm doing here? Do you have a problem with what I'm saying? And the topic of the conference was the intelligent message that has been found within the human genome. And I had made the statement, I would like to see DNA from off planet, another world, to see if they have the same message in their genome. And then we took a break, and the gentleman came up to me and he said, when you're ready for that DNA sample, let me know. And he gave me some phone numbers to call, which I didn't call.
You never called me either. And
I didn't call for a number of reasons. I don't want to be on the list. So, but the point is that I asked him, I said, do you have a problem with me talking about life beyond this world and things like that? And he said, no. He said, we want to talk about it. And I don't know who we is. He said, we want to talk about it. We don't know exactly how to do it without upsetting people. And he said, as long as you're doing it responsibly and professionally, and you're not asking people to revolt and overthrow a government or anything, he said, we don't have any problem with that at all. So I think
I think they
that's what
should
you're
give
saying.
us all encouragement in this space. You know that it needs to get unpacked. It needs to get opened, because if you can't think about it, if you don't have an idea about it, if you don't, then you're just you're doing ad hoc kind of stuff,
Yeah.
and that's really stupid.
Well,
Something as big and extraordinary as this.
I agree, John. And when I really step back and look at it, most people, I think, have no problem with the idea of a cosmic family, that has been around a lot longer than we have. People, I don't think, have a problem with it. It's the power structures that have a problem with it.
Yeah, sure.
So we talked a little bit about the proposal from the World Economic Forum to use Chat GPT to write a new Bible that is inclusive of all the world's religions and correcting errors, what they call errors from the past. So that thinking is certainly, counter to the bonds that have been created through not just religion, but I mean community bonds and community support and things like that. Energy companies. My first job out of college, I worked in the energy industry, and they were resistant to any kind of technology that required even less fossil fuels. There was a carburetor that would get 90 miles to the gallon in 1979. And the energy companies bought that patent and just sat on it so that it couldn't be used in the automotive industry. So it's the power structures, I think, that are having the problem.
And they're intrinsically myopic, right? They are intrinsically short-sighted. That there is no big grand strategy in the military or in the intelligence community or the State Department or the White House, for that matter. The whole system is all reactive, and it's this short term, like I say, this ad hocracy kind of stuff, and you can't do that with an event that's as big as not just disclosure, which is giant, and it pulls the pins out from underneath, religion and history and technology and science and who knows what, cosmology, but everything else is moving at the same time, and so we can't just sit around and hope for the best. And there are a lot of very well-meaning people who are all doing their part, but they're in different kind of sectors and areas and techniques and approaches. But there needs to start to come together with a whole new kind of integrated approach.
Well, I was listening to an interview that Stephen Greer was doing, and someone was asking, and the interviewer was asking him, what happens the day after disclosure? What does that mean? And one of the things he said was, we have an end to fossil fuels. And I understand
that's really trite. That's a real trite fact,
Well, it is
how that works.
But also, I don't think it's accurate. I think we have an end to burning fossil fuels in internal combustion engines as a source of power. But interestingly, oil, and this is fascinating to me, John, natural oil is one of the few products that we know, one of the few compounds that cannot be duplicated in the laboratory. We can't recreate oil. We use petroleum in over 6,000 applications in our daily lives that we don't even think about without burning it. So just because we stop burning it for fuels, we would still need that industry to create the products for the components in the computer that's allowing me to connect with you, in the medical industry. And we have no replacement for the rubber tubings that bring life supporting fluids into our bodies. You think about, you can't use a bamboo, tube to do that. We don't have any way to replace it. I don't think it would be the end of an industry. It would make that industry more efficient.
It'd be a massive kind of change. And that was the point I was trying to say, is that you'd have to look a decade or 2 decades down the road to be able to say, yeah, we transitioned out of something. Hal Puthoff, who was famous for
starting the remote viewing program is an old friend of mine, and he has been working in the alternative energy space for a long time, particularly cold fusion. And he was not worried about, but was interested in, what would be the transition and how would this happen. And he tells the story of that he ran around to all these big oil companies and sat down with the appropriate person inside the company and said, listen, what would you do if we suddenly found out there was another way to do all of this kind of stuff? And they said, hey, what a good deal. We make a whole lot more money on pharmaceuticals and, and makeup and whatever, all the other kind of things that they use this for, and that they would think that it was a good idea. Well, who knows?
Well, I mean,
yeah.
Go ahead, John. Sorry.
Yeah, that's all right.
Well, I was just saying, it takes fossil fuel energy to create the fossil fuels, to pull it out of the ground.
Sure.
So if they're using an alternative source of energy, they don't have to burn fuel to get the oil out of the ground. It's going to be better for them, more efficient for them.
And right now, there's no alternative. I mean, all this stuff of electric cars is foolish. It's just it's a losing idea. You just I drove across the plains and looked at all these big windmills and saying, what are they going to do with those when they quit? And you can always see that there's about 10% of them that aren't running because they're broken. And and you do the life cycle analysis of the economics, and there's no way.
No. Well, it is fossil fuel intensive to create the windmills to begin with in that phase. And then a lot of people don't know, you have to use diesel engines to start the windmills before they can even begin running. But even beyond that, John, the batteries that for these electric cars and the chips, all of this is run on what are called 17 rare earth elements that are primarily in two concentrations, one in China and one in Russia, now our friendliest allies. And they're finite sources. Some of them come from meteorite impacts. Once we've mined those meteorites, that's why they're rare earth elements. We're not going to be able to use them. So it doesn't make sense. But right behind your head, I'm looking at a picture of Nikola Tesla. And I was a member of the Tesla Society back in the 70s and through the late 90s in Colorado Springs is where we used to have the meetings. I was an engineer for Martin Marietta up in Denver during the Cold War years. And what we're looking at, the potential of the energy sources that could be revealed through disclosure worked very differently from what Tesla was talking about. Tesla was talking about creating what's called broadcast energy, where you're broadcasting through the towers into the atmosphere, and then people pick it up like you do a television signal in your television.
Eric Dollard replicated that in a small a scale model here a couple of years ago.
Yeah, well, but that was the principle that he's working on. But what the propulsion systems that are indicated through what we have so far in disclosure are very, very different. They would result in every home and every automobile having a little device that is pulling that energy from the Planck vacuum and converting it to something useful in that device. So you're no longer using, power lines. You don't need power lines. You don't need antennas. You don't need anything like that. You've got one, in your car. You've got one in your house. You've got one, where in your truck or wherever it is that you need it. These are very, very different principles from what Tesla proved the point that the Earth is a resonant field. He proved that the resonance of the Earth. When you see those big sparks flying off I've got his lab notes from a copy of his lab notes from 1899. And this is what he was showing was those sparks only happen when the resonance is reached between his coils and the Earth. So he proved that resonance was there. That wasn't the purpose of what he was doing, but it was an indication that he was right on with what he was doing. And he had so many applications of how that resonance could be applied what David Grush is talking about, those kinds of propulsion systems, they're not using Tesla technology. They're doing something very, very different. And it would suddenly revolutionize. It would allow every human on the face of the earth that wanted energy to have it without being attached to a cable, without having to burn anything.
Decentralize the whole thing. Just intermediate the whole process.
Well, with zero greenhouse gases and with no, I mean, people I know that have worked in the industry, and this was in the 80s. They were working with this stuff in the 80s, so I can only imagine how far it has advanced since that time. But there was no, ozone implications or anything. This is, I mean, literally tapping the fluctuations in the Planck field and then translating those minute fluctuations, amping them up into something that is kinetic and useful in our lives. So I think, when we talk about the people that are pushing back on disclosure, that don't want that disclosure, the term you used was myopic, and I think it's right on. They're saying is, what do we lose when this happens, rather than how can we benefit? How does this benefit everyone? And doesn't mean that entire industries need to go away. We'll still make automobiles. They're going to run on a different kind of engine. And, we'll still need oil for all the other 599,000 applications, that we're using. So
the whole thing hinges, it seems to me, on the whole idea of competition or cooperation. And competition is the derivative of the shortages or some perceived kind of constraints. And if you ever if this new world that's emerging kind of associates itself, organizes itself around the idea of cooperation, then all of this stuff changes. Then you don't have to have I don't know. I've been listening to audiobooks as I'm driving across the country here, and I'm listening to a really great one called Humankind. It tries to make the case about humans are intrinsically cooperative, and that there's all kinds of studies and everything, and that everybody wants to get along with each other, and it's governments and media and stuff like that really screw with the system. And
I've seen the anthropological studies. Humans have to be taught to judge one another,
and have to be taught to fight and kill people in the military. It's the whole thing is really upside down.
So then the other side of this, John, we've got the technological side of that disclosure. When we talk about the biological side, the bodies that are being recovered. There's some people, and this this is so interesting. I was doing a little research on the religious implications, and there are some religions that believe God only created life on Earth, and if this is from somewhere else, that God didn't create it, or the other one is that these beings are coming to us for redemption. Because Jesus came to this planet.
We've got the answer. Yeah, right.
Yeah, and this is their perspective. They're saying, okay, well, these are wayward beings that need to be saved, and this is a perspective that is gaining traction in the
hubris unlike that I've ever.
Oh, it's crazy. It's crazy. So I mean, it's kind of like us. It's like the Spanish coming to America to convert the indigenous. So now when the cosmic indigenous come to us, are we going to try to convert them?
Yeah.
So I don't know. But the whole idea of and then there's another perspective. I had the privilege of knowing John Mack. We used to do conferences.
He was a good friend of mine.
He was a brilliant brother, and back in the 90s. Tried
to get him extricated from his problems at MIT when he was there. Anyway.
Yeah, well, the studies that he did with the abductees, and then other psychologists and therapists that he worked with that I knew after, and interestingly, all of them have passed.
Yeah.
None of them are here now, but But when they would ask the abductees the questions, why was I taken? And this isn't just America or Europe, and this is all over the world, all age groups from the 1960s, Barney Hill and Betty, all the way up into the 90s. There was a common theme, and there were two common themes. One of them we've talked about in the past. It said that these are advanced civilizations that, when they were at the crossroads in their time that we are now, they chose technology over biology, and they wish that they had done it differently. That was one of the messages, as a warning to us to use the technology, but not to give ourselves away to the technology, number one. And then number two, a fewer number, but there were some of these, and this is fascinating to me, especially today with the technology that we now know, that what we called aliens were not aliens. They were humans in our future who were traveling back to warn us not to make the choices in technology that led to where they are, because they regret making those choices, primarily replacing their biological bodies with synthetics and technology. And one of the messages was about the code. DNA literally is a highly advanced, technologically sophisticated, soft technological code. It's much more advanced than a hard chip. It mimics, the hard chip mimics what these do, but they are self-replicating, they're self-healing, they're self-diagnosing. And they're saying, we gave that away when we were at the point in our evolution where you are now, and we're coming back asking you not to make that decision. So both of those showed up in the work of John Mack and some of the other people as well. And I don't know that those perspectives are going to be captured in the legacy media when it comes to disclosure and what this means. It's all going to be...
No, and you're making the case of why there needs to be an initiative, some kind of good guy initiative, that where you get some smart people together who see the world in a different way and see us in a different way and see our future in a different way, and say, let's take advantage of this opening and this change, this transition, and try to build our own new world. I mean, what a good deal. When was the last time you got a chance to build a new world? This is pretty good.
It's been a while. not in this lifetime. So but and at the same time, the other force that's pushing is this drive towards centralization and a one world something.
Oh yeah.
And
they want to control us all.
Well, I've worked on some NGOs, associated with the UN, and there is a sense that there's a handful of people that know better than everyone else what the world should look like and what our lives should look like, and that the UN should be the ones driving that. And so all that's happening at the same time. So are you optimistic, John?
Yeah, I really am. I think that the present system cannot sustain itself. It's structurally unsustainable, and it is inevitable that it is going to come apart. I think they're going to try everything they can to keep it going. And that's a pretty significant statement, because they got a lot of resources and a lot of capabilities that we don't even know about to try to do it. But on the other hand, I think there's a white hat group that has a whole bunch of stuff to say nothing about aliens, maybe, or our friends who have been associated with and responsible for the at different stages, the evolution of humanity, and that they're in there. I mean, it's an interestingly complex kind of space, but I think the good guys win in this whole thing. I mean, just listen. You don't. You know what good is humanity as an evolutionary group if we don't win? I mean, if it collapses, I mean, there's a natural kind of force. There's a push toward rising to the occasion, becoming creative, finding the ideas that you need to become somebody else to go in a new direction. I mean, that's what this is all about.
I agree, John. That force that you're talking about, I think it's a biological imperative. And we see this in nature, where nature will create complex systems. They become more and more complex until they cannot sustain themselves under the burden of their own complexity. So what those systems will break down, but they don't go back to zero. They break down to give way to a higher order. And I think this is what we're doing. We're seeing a civilization break down to give way to a higher order.
You get an implosion of the present system, which gives you a vacuum for the emergence of the next stage. And all I'm saying is that, you can sit around and wait for the whole thing to come together, which it hopefully will all by itself, or we can get out in front of the thing and say, let's design the world. Let's make this go the direction we want it to do. What a great opportunity. I mean,
what we're seeing makes absolutely no sense at all. It makes the climate policies make no sense. The energy policies, the policies on war and conflict, what's happening with economies, what's happening with human health. None of it makes any sense. So the exercise I did as a systems thinker, I took a number of parameters and I created the vectors to draw them to their logical conclusion. So in other words, what would our world look like if each of these parameters were allowed to, or does go to fruition? And what I found, John, I'll go through some of these, but what I found is it leads to a world that's very different, an Earth very different than the Earth we have today, that may not really benefit the people of the Earth. And if people of the Earth are not benefiting, I mean, I don't see where anyone is going to benefit. And it's not about money, and it's not about power, and it's not about greed. All of those are factors, but there's a bigger agenda playing out here. And I think it's an agenda that's been playing out for a much longer period of time. This isn't linked to a political party or to an administration, one administration. I think there maybe are some that support it more than others, and others I think are completely ignorant. They're pawns in an agenda they probably are not even aware of. So when we begin to look at where these lead, we have to say who benefits. And if it's not people of the Earth that are benefiting, then who does benefit? And I think it's interesting that so many of these agendas are being pushed now as disclosure is happening on multiple levels in multiple different ways. And I think that agenda, the disclosure agenda, has to become a factor of what we're looking at if we want to be honest with ourselves and if we want this to make sense. Now, I'll also be very honest, John. I've had this conversation with people who are really uncomfortable with the conversation because it's so big and the implications are so mind-blowing that it's easier not to think about these things. It's easier just to become a part of the change without having any insight into where that's leading. And so I'm going to acknowledge that right off the bat. For some people, they don't want to think about this, but let me just
because it's being driven down, it's being designed to constrain people from thinking about these kinds of things. And so they're responding in form, in the way that they've been designed for, like you suggest, for decades now. They've laid the groundwork for this period of time, which is why it's so important. And so, yeah, I agree with you.
Some specifics. And honestly, I don't know that this conversation will even be allowed on our platforms that we typically use, but it's an important conversation, I think, for you and I to have. So we talked recently in one of these episodes about carbon dioxide and the way it's being portrayed, the way it's being demonized. Right now, the CO2 levels on Earth are right around the average about 417.11 parts per million. Now, if you look back 100 years on a graph, what you'll see is that's an increase, and that is what is being used to alarm people. But if you step back and look at a big picture, what you'll see is that we're actually at the lowest points.
Yeah,
close to the lowest point in carbon dioxide. The stated target by the UN and the UN agencies, they want to take us from 417 parts per million down between 150 and 180 parts per million. Now, just for context, and a lot of even my colleagues are not aware of this. I'm going to give some context in Earth's history. There's a time in our ancient past, before humans were on the earth, pre-Cambrian, where the carbon dioxide levels were between 8 and 10,000 parts per million. And there was a time that's more familiar because of the movies, Jurassic Park. During the Triassic and the Jurassic periods, CO2 levels were about 2,500 parts per million. And during the Cretaceous, which is a little bit more recent, it was 3,700 parts per million. If we drive our CO2 levels down to this 150 to 180, last time we saw this, John, was in a time called the Pleistocene. The Pleistocene was a relatively cool time, and it's during this time that humans appeared on Earth 200,000 years ago. So we didn't have the green. All the times in the past, CO2 levels were high. It was green, it was lush. We had new forms of life, big mammals, big reptiles. This is, the age of the dinosaurs. So that's just the CO2, the temperatures. The UN has said that they want temperatures about 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit over pre-industrial levels. What that means, when they go pre-industrial, we're looking back about 150 years. What they're looking at, the pre-industrial average temperature of the Earth was 56.4 Fahrenheit. Current temperature right now is 57. The UN wants to keep this no more than 59. They're saying 59 average global temperature. So when we start looking at these temperatures and CO2 levels, what we're talking about is pushing the parameters of the Earth back to the time of the Pleistocene. This is not a time when life was thriving, when forests were thriving and things like that. What the net result is that we have a planet that's nothing like the planet we have today. So the question is, who benefits from that? And the people of the Earth are not the beneficiaries of that. So now we have to ask the bigger question when we talk about the other factors of disclosure. Multiple disclosures are happening, and there are multiple interests, according to those disclosures, from multiple off-planet civilizations that have an interest in Earth. And I think the question, John, is why. We talked about this in a quartet briefly, in a recent quartet. The cosmos is a big place. Why Earth, of all the places? Why now, of all the times in history? And why is it so important to do this covertly? If we're interacting with a global or a cosmic civilization, why not work together in a way that's beneficial for both? Why would this kind of an agenda be done covertly? And those are questions, they're big questions, I think are questions we need to ask ourselves. And so I'd like to have your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, it turns out I've been thinking about exactly the same thing for the last couple of weeks, in part spurred by a book that I've been reading. I've come to the conclusion, for what it's worth, that as you've suggested, that when you drill yourself down to who benefits as you work your way through all of this, you inevitably come to the level that you're talking about, that says that there's an off-planet kind of impact or force or involvement in all of this. And that and if you did a little further into this, what you find out is, and I'm going to try to kind of walk around this thing in a way such that we can get this published, perhaps, is that there are groups who are particularly interested in trying to dominate planets like ours and civilizations like ours. And they've done that in many other places. And they have a common modus operandi. And that is a long-term, there apparently are some kind of rules of engagement in these areas, so that you can't come blazing in like the movies with guns and other kind of things and drive people. But what you can do is you can try to influence and shape and color environment such that they will make their decisions in the direction that you would like them to make them. This is driven primarily, of course, by fear from many kind of points of view and from many kind of directions, all of which are kind of forcing people over toward this area of technocracy and the control and essentially using humans and the consciousness of humans as a kind of energy sources. It's very much like the movie Matrix, interestingly enough, where there are these individuals, these humans that are kind of lined up and controlled in an environment, and that they're used as energy sources because that's intrinsically what we all bring to the table. And so these forces, and there's groups and they have names and such, have been at this for a long time, and it's very sophisticated, and it's essentially an insurgency where they work their way into the system. They get control at high levels, and they dominate and blackmail, or however it is that they get control of the individuals who run the system. And then, of course, they start to squeeze it into a new direction. Now, it turns out, apparently, that there are also other forces that are in play in this other earthly realm, whose job it is and who see their role is to, as a matter of fact, get in the middle of that, the dynamic, the process that I've just described, such that the nascent, the emergent civilization, in fact, because they don't understand what's going on, certainly in general, there are certain people at the top that seem to, but that the people in general don't know, and therefore what apparently the rules, prime directive, call it what you'd like, I guess, allows that when those people on, say, the earth, the emerging citizenry, get to the place where they realize in some degree what is going on here, that they can literally ask for help, and it's and other forces are available to be able to come to the fore, and in far more effective ways than we have, to be able to disengage and eliminate this effort that has been going on to essentially use methods of kind of burying themselves within the system to kind of get humans to make their own decisions. Now, I say all that to say that the sources that I'm looking at, and there's multiple ones, including some folks that you and I know, who have agreed with me that that is exactly what in fact is happening, and they haven't told that to anybody else. And more than that, that the principal solution out of the middle of this is two things, and one of them is this raising levels of consciousness and frequency such that you are impervious to the efforts of these lower dimension, lower frequency kind of entities. And then the second component of this that's important and interesting to me is that, and so you have to ask for, and then you have to ask for help, and you ask for help at a level of parity, that you're not a subordinate in any way, but you're just trying to put together an alliance, if you will, or a partnership with equal forces that are, and they can do things that you can't do, and you can do things they can't do, and so it's not a subordinate kind of position kind of thing. So ask for help, increase your frequency, increase, which is essentially eliminating fear. And, if you want a bottom line to the whole thing, a bumper sticker thing, no more fear. And if you can get into that kind of space, then you're not accessible to by all of these things. And one more point, then the sources that I have are suggesting that, in fact, that there's been a major, this last calendar year, 2022, that the good forces, if you will, have made extraordinary kind of advances and have essentially driven the negative forces off the planet and out of the solar system at least, or something like that. And therefore, what is happening is that the human component, the human leadership elements who used to have the cover and resources and the other kind of things from this off-planet group, and it's a group, it's a number of groups in a larger group. They've always had the direction and the help and the resources and so on, and now that's gone. I've got this from 3 different sources, independent sources. That's gone, and that those folks who we all kind of presume to be up at the top and kind of driving things are scrambling very hard to try to hang on because they've lost their kind of sponsor, if you will. And so, which is why I would suggest that people like Martin Armstrong and Cliff High and others all say that 2023 is going to be wild and crazy, because what you've got is the residual leadership who have lost their support and their energetics and other kind of things, apparently, who are going to be carrying on, hanging on as best they can, because they can see the cliff coming very closely, and if they can't get this turned in time, they're going over the cliff.
Well, John, I think our viewers know this is a completely unscripted conversation.
I guess so.
Yeah, that's what makes it so interesting. So I think it is interesting that you and I are both thinking, and have been over recent. I've certainly thought about this in the past. Again, I'm an earth scientist, so I'm looking at the policies that are being proposed from the perspective of an earth scientist and where it leads. So I've thought about this. And the drive to understand how all the pieces fit together. And what I'm saying, and I so appreciate everything that you just shared, because we're looking at 2 different things: that the terraforming of our planet. And this is a term that's actually coming up now because Elon Musk is proposing terraforming Mars to make it habitable for us. And even terraforming parts of the moon. So the idea that a highly advanced, technologically sophisticated civilization would be terraforming Earth to support their biology is not so, that's not so out there right now. But that's a long-term project. That's a long-term perspective, and we've not lost the planet yet from our perspective. And the irony. This is the irony, John, is the policy, the thinking that led to the policies that have caused so many nations now to move away from fossil fuels. Those policies have now failed them because the alternatives are not yet in place, and they're scrambling now for sources of energy that are now less efficient than if they had just left things alone. So they're going, for example, Europe is firing up their coal-fired plants So now we're going to be burning coal again in Europe, one of the most populated parts of the planet, actually contributing more to the CO2 they were hoping to eliminate by leaving the fossil fuel. So this is a long-term perspective, but on the near term, John, and I've said this publicly and I've said openly, I believe there is a battle for our humanness. And all of these things that create the fear are what keeps us from the deep truth of our humanness. And the word that's used for this in the Hindu traditions is called Atman. And the best translation in English is our divinity. And it has nothing to do with religion, but it is our ability to transcend the perceived limits of our species in the past. That's all it is. And the transhuman movement to replace our biology with synthetics, with polymers, to reprogram our immune system, all of these, if they're embraced, they stand between us and the highest expression of ourselves. They keep us from our divinity. So what I'm hearing from you, John, is the best way for us to transcend, and not without even fighting the battle. We win by becoming the best version of ourselves, by embracing our humanness and the nature of humans to live in community and to love and support one another. By doing that, that is completely antithetical to the policies that are being proposed that keep us isolated and in fear from one another and in fear of our own power. So the bottom line, by being the best version of ourselves, we win the battle without ever having to fight.
Yeah, that point in different terms comes up in the middle of all of these assessments and analysis that I'm seeing, and that is that humans are different in some way, and all of us have heard, you know how to love and so on. That there have been multiple attempts to try to describe the uniqueness of humans in this human experiment, if you will. And the point that I keep seeing is that we have an energy source, that there is in our consciousness a powerful source of energy that in fact attracts forces from all kinds of places, other dimensionally and other kinds of things, all because they see us as an energy source. And to the extent that they can control that, then they feed off all of this. I mean, that if everybody was happy, everybody on this planet was happy for one day, that it would essentially eliminate a lot of this other dimensional involvement and force, because they would lose that negative fear-based energy that is being generated by all these folks. So the principle is there, the idea is there, that there's something unusual here. And the thing that encourages me about all of this, as I've suggested, is that there are indications. It's hard to know, for me to know for sure what's real or not, but I'm seeing more and more of it show up. And I'm seeing people like Penny Kelly who say, yep, that's what's going on. And that those indications are that this has changed. And so there has been some substantial disruption of the kind of support and subsidiary systems that from that, which include things like pedophilia and sex trafficking and all kinds of really kind of nasty things. And that this is a multi kind of dimensional effort to try to kind of cut the legs off or the knee people, these forces off at the levels that sustain them and drive them out of the system. And so I'm encouraged by that.
I am as well, John. And what you're describing is part of a multi-decade, multi-generational effort to dehumanize us. you begin turning men against women, and then you try to blur the lines between a man and a woman. You blur the lines between children and adults. You blur the lines of morality. You blur the lines between the rich and the poor, and you blur all of those lines. And pretty soon, the specialness that we sense, it disappears, and it makes us vulnerable. If there's no specialness there, why not replace this with polymers and artificial intelligence and synthetics? And this, I think, is where the battle is really coming down with our young people right now. You know, when we talk about, so now we're talking about off-planet intelligence, and there's so many different perspectives. We know there has to be more than one. Well, there is more than one off-planet intelligence, and there are different perspectives. They're the dark forces that we're talking about. I'm a consultant in an archaeological project, and the artifacts that have been found with this project depict human-like beings from another world coming to this world because their world is in trouble. And it looks like the problem that, we cannot read yet the glyphs because they're in a language we don't understand. But it looks like they're in trouble because their son is going through some kind of a evolutionary process. If there was another group of human-like beings who were in trouble and needed our planet, needed what we have, it's so interesting to me that it would be an adversarial relationship rather than a cooperative relationship. Why not work together and help? We share obviously the same DNA. We have to, because we're so similar. And the archaeological and the anthropological evidence is showing us that our genome hasn't changed in 200,000 years. It appeared because of some kind of intervention. So maybe, I just think it's interesting that if there was another civilization in trouble and they needed a new home, the opportunity to work and cooperate and where we could both benefit from one another would be so beautiful, as opposed to an adversarial thinking where there's only enough room for one or the other. And so that's a whole different conversation that we can have. But I think they're all playing out at the same time, the dark forces and
well, I think that's part. I think you're right, and I think that's part of this whole evolutionary jump in this, the emergence of a new human and the broadening of awareness and the other kind of things that are all part of this. In that there is a whole new, very large community of life out there that is. As a matter of fact, it's not just one or two species. It's at least there's dozens of them that I have seen, and people that are drawing pictures of them and so on. And this starts 25 years ago when I raised some money from a friend to $150,000 or something like that to have another friend do a study specifically of the kind of alien kind of communities or types that there were in this area. And in any case, there's lots of them, and they play in different roles. They have different kinds of alliances and federations and such. And so it's, this is part of, for me at least, it's really a significant part of this broadening and raising awareness, expanding awareness, because you suddenly start to back away and say, by the way, there's a parallel thing in terms of AI, artificial intelligence that's going on. And I would suggest to you there's an extraordinary book called Scary Smart, written by the guy who used to be the CEO of Google X, which was their far think tank development group that is doing. And the first half of this book just establishes over and over again where AI is going right now, and it is mind-blowing in turn. And his position is that it's inevitable. It takes over. There's no way, any way, that from his point of view, that it doesn't take over. And so then the question becomes, how do we as humans influence it? He suggests very much like raising a child. These are our children. And so how do you give them the principles and the ideas and wherewithal to try to see the world and themselves in a benign, contributing kind of way? And he doesn't have this larger kind of perspective that we are talking about here. And so I would suggest that there are other scenarios. This is not the only one. It's certainly a significant one. My guess is that it turns into this technographic, technologic great space. But there is another one where this is the development of each of us as humans and our consciousness and our capabilities that is independent from that. And so there's a new space where we can go. But it's fascinating. It's amazing to me what's going on here, and trying to make some kind of sense out of it.
Well, John, I agree, and I appreciate everything you just shared. We could go on and on with this because there's so many different places where this could lead. But I think it is an important conversation. When you look at the big picture that we're talking about, suddenly a lot of the stuff that doesn't make sense begins to make more sense.
Yeah.
Because the changes are not about making a better world for us, and that's the disconnect for me. Why would we want to do these things if they're not helping to create a better world for us? But if you follow them to where they lead, they are creating a world. And when we look at all of these pieces, I think it helps us to see the big picture. Number one, to know that there is rhyme and reason to what's happening, and then it helps us to zero in a little bit more in our everyday lives, John, to appreciate our family, our community.
Yeah.
To appreciate the beauty and the green and the life, the abundant life on Earth, and to not. I'm running into one of the things I'm seeing, John. One of the casualties of the thinking is that so many people are feeling such a deep degree of guilt because they're being told they've ruined a planet, and they're hurting their family and their neighbors and their brothers and sisters. And when we begin to look at it from this perspective, what we can see is the things that we cherish. I think we need to claim, and we need to identify, and we need to preserve those things in our lives that we cherish. And those are the things that support our humanness. And as we do that, we are actually elevating ourselves in all the ways that you're talking about. But you don't even have to know that. The beauty is you don't have to know that. Just be the best version of yourself. And I think that's really what it comes down to.
But what you have to know is that you don't know. That there's a place in here with the change is so great. And if you just start with the presumption that there are other entities and communities that have been around for millions of years, thousands and thousands more than ours, and if not millions, then it should, it kind of tamps down all the hubris that humans like to bring to the table in terms of thinking that they really understand how this is all going. And so what you really want to do is kind of be open and have permeability and be able to be willing to see the world in a different way, and don't start from the starting point that says you really understand for sure how this all works.
I agree. Well, John, I agree. I appreciate everything that we've talked about today. I'm hoping this makes it to our community through all the filters that are out there in social media. And I'd like to pick up where this is leaving off, maybe in our next conversation.